Welcome to the Faculty of Education and the beginning of our symposium series, Revisioning Teacher Education, Responding to the TRC's Calls to Action. Good evening, honored guests, visitors, faculty, students, and community members. We're so glad you could be here tonight. Also, just a special acknowledgement to any elders who may be in the audience. We are privileged and honored that you are here. Thank you. My name is Melanie Jansen. I'm the Associate Dean of the Undergraduate Programs in the Faculty of Education. And I'd like to acknowledge my colleague tonight, Dr. Frank Deer, a co-organizer of this event. Dr. Deer and I are both very honored that you're all here tonight, so welcome. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the U of M's campuses are on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dakota, and the Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and the mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to moving forward with Indigenous communities in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And it's in that spirit of reconciliation and collaboration that we welcome you here tonight. A few housekeeping items. Bathrooms, outside, down the hall, and hang a right. There'll also be people in the hallway to direct you, should you get lost. And also we'd like you to just know that on our Faculty of Education homepage, there's a website dedicated to our symposium series. There you'll be able to find recordings of this event and the next two symposia, as well as any documented information that we collect over the 3 days proceedings. So we encourage you to go to our faculty's website, and on the landing page you'll see a place that you can click to find out more. We are so pleased to have with us Justice Murray Sinclair. Welcome. His address is part of a symposium series that's hosted by our faculty and in which all post-secondary institutions in Manitoba are participating. The purpose of the symposium series is to work with Justice Sinclair, the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, and scholars from across Canada to help us think about the Truth and Reconciliation's calls to action and to guide our discussions in what the calls to action mean for education and for teacher education in Manitoba. Justice Sinclair and his fellow commissioners have made explicit in the calls to action what needs to be done. I believe it is our responsibility now to take up those calls and to make them a reality. So to begin with, I'd like to start by opening this evening's event by calling on Carl Stone, a U of M advisor and cultural coordinator at Magizia-Gimmick, our Indigenous Student Center. I would now like to call on Dr. David Manzik, the Dean of the Faculty of Education, to bring some greetings.
Thanks, Melanie, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending tonight's session. And thank you, Carl, for setting the right tone for this evening. Tonight, we're indeed fortunate to have Justice Murray Sinclair here in the faculty to talk about the TRC's calls to action. I want to thank Justice Sinclair personally for his approximately 6.5 years as the Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation process. I can only imagine the stories that you heard from survivors of Indian residential schools. I heard a number of them myself, but I can imagine doing this work for 6.5 years and the pain and the suffering you must have heard about as survivors recalled their time in these institutions. It must have been incredibly difficult and undoubtedly life-changing for you. I think it's also important for us to acknowledge the many requests that Justice Sinclair is now receiving from universities, colleges, and other educational institutions across the country. His work is not done. And as they try to come to grips with how to respond to the TRC's calls to action. If I were to put myself in your shoes, Justice Sinclair, I would imagine that the sense of obligation you must feel to carry on with this work must be incredibly overwhelming at times. And so we certainly appreciate you giving of your time to be with us tonight and tomorrow morning, particularly in light of the recent announcement that you've been appointed to the Senate. Congratulations. As some of you will know, Indigenous teacher education has become a top priority here in the Faculty of Education, particularly in the last few years. And we are proud of some of our recent initiatives. So I'd just like to take a few minutes to talk about some of the things that we're doing. And by no means am I saying that we've finished our work. We are just scratching the surface. In response to the Association of Canadian Deans of Education's Accord on Indigenous Education, and other policy documents, a few years ago we created a new position, Director of Indigenous Initiatives, taken up by our own Dr. Frank Deere, who's in the front row here, to help us move our efforts in this area forward. Just last month, as many of you will have heard in the media, we had approved at Senate our new diversity admissions policy that aims for 15% of our B.Ed enrollment to be taken up by Indigenous students, a percentage that will come closer to the percentage of Aboriginal students in Winnipeg and Manitoba classrooms. A new Indigenous student group has just been formed from the ground up, and we are excited about how we might work with members of this student group to increase our knowledge of Indigenous perspectives and knowledges. As some of you know, we are also currently working on an Indigenous teacher education program led by Frank Deere, and we are about to move into the consultation process, so you may be asked to be part of those consultations. And finally, we've just wrapped up a very successful post-bac cohort in Indigenous perspectives with teachers from the Louis Riel School Division, and some of you probably were involved in that cohort. So we feel that we're making some progress in the area, but I can tell you quite honestly, it never feels that we're doing enough, and it never feels that changes are happening quickly enough. Tonight promises to be an opportunity to kickstart those initiatives that are already underway and to plant the seeds for other actions we should be considering to ensure that Indigenous students in this province have the same opportunities for success as non-Indigenous students, and to ensure that all students in the province, all students, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, understand that we all have a collective responsibility to know what has happened in the past and to be part of the solution moving forward. Tonight, Justice Sinclair will address three specific questions. They are: in what ways do the findings of the TRC and the calls to action inform teacher education in Canada? What action needs to be taken by initial teacher education programs immediately? And finally, what needs to inform these programs' plans for the long term? Now, before I hand things over to Justice Sinclair, I'd like to turn to our colleague, Mr. Ry Morin, Director of the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, who will do a proper introduction of Justice Sinclair, a more formal introduction. Once again, thank you for joining us tonight, and we look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's very nice to be here this evening, and it's certainly a deep honor for me to introduce Justice Murray Sinclair, a man, a leader, a visionary that I've had the deep honor of working with now for the last close to 6 years. Justice Sinclair came to the Commission after a very long and esteemed career in a variety of areas. He, of course, led the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, which today still is regarded as the seminal work on Aboriginal justice issues in the country. Coming into the Commission, Justice Sinclair was faced with an enormous task. In 2008, an initial commission had been formed with 3 original commissioners. And that commission faltered, and it failed. And Justice Sinclair and the other 3 commissioners were brought in to rekindle what many believed was the most critical process that this country would go through in the early part of the century, and perhaps could be that turning point that we have sought to see in this country for so long. And I think it's worthwhile putting yourself in Justice Sinclair's shoes for a moment about what that responsibility looked like in 2009, in June 2009. At that time, many people were saying that the Commission was too ambitious. It was even perhaps set up to fail, that there was no possible way any commission could achieve the mandate that it was given to gather statements, to collect documents, to inspire this process of reconciliation that has led us to this very room today. And in that jumble of words that was the TRC's mandate that was given to them by the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, somehow Justice Sinclair and the other commissioners were able to create a staff and create processes and create a process that led the Commission across the country, some 900 visits, some 7,000 statements, and millions upon millions of records that have now found their way here to the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. The enormity of this task, we've already heard from David, must have been overwhelming at times, and the pain and suffering of survivors certainly was, and that was certainly something that I think all of us at the TRC shared in. I think it's fair to say that perhaps what caught many of us off guard was just the depth and the extent of the hurt and the pain across the country. Yet somehow we have been brought through the vision, the wisdom, through the gentle guidance and the honorable words of Justice Sinclair to an inspired nation that is perhaps more ready than ever to embrace the calls for action, to right wrongs that have been existing in this country for far too long, that finally we are now starting to see change. So it's my great honor to introduce a great man, a great leader, a great Canadian who has inspired not just Indigenous peoples to find healing and a path of reconciliation in their own communities, but has inspired the country to collectively imagine who we can be together in a better way. So without further ado, Senator Justice Murray Sinclair.
Okay, I have to start turning things on here, right? Is that working? Okay. Apparently I'm wired. Right? Am I good? Okay. Now I can talk to you. I have a deep privilege of being here this evening with you. Although I should tell you that I was challenged to continue with the invitation because tonight my granddaughter Sarah is delivering her school division French language speech to see if she's the best speech maker in the school division in her age group. And it so happens that her topic is about residential schools. So she texted me this afternoon and said, "Are you going to be there?" And I said, "I'll be there in spirit," thinking about her. And so I told her to break a leg. And she said, "Why?" So I had to explain that. I am a Zenegijik. I am of the Fish clan of our people, third degree Medewan, and proud to be Ojibwe. I have a couple of things I want to show you tonight. One is I have a video that I want to begin my presentation with, but not just yet. And I also have a PowerPoint that's going to play in the background while I'm talking. So it's not. It contains the calls to action relating to education that are in our report. But before I begin, I want to acknowledge all the survivors who might be here. I know there are a few. All the survivors, just put your hand up so that we can all acknowledge that we have survivors of residential schools here with us. Thank you for being here. And also want to just ask all of those who are children of survivors or who are grandchildren, nephews, nieces of survivors. We acknowledge you as well, because you too are living a legacy of residential schools. And the last few days have been an interesting time for me because, of course, all of the media attention of this appointment that has been foisted upon me. But and one of the questions that comes out of it is, in fact, am I going to be Senator Justice Sinclair? And I think the answer to that is probably no. Unless I do what Clara Hughes, one of our honorary witnesses, gave me an idea about. A number of months ago, Clara introduced me to her mother, and her mother, because Clara and her mother still lives here in Winnipeg, and her mother was telling me a story that one day she has a little coffee group that meets in her house, and they were listening to an interview that I did with Michael Enright on the radio, and So she said that they were listening away, and one of the women in her coffee group, her daughter was there with her, and her daughter was pregnant. And she said that her daughter was so taken by what I said in the course of that interview that she said to her mother, "I'm going to name my child, if he's a boy, after Murray Sinclair." And so sure enough, a few months later, she had a little boy. And so his name is Justice. So that's given me an idea about how I can hang on to this title, which everybody, of course, seems to know me by. And so being Senator Justice Murray Sinclair might be a feasible option yet if I take the $28 or whatever it costs to go down and do a legal name change. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Ryan, and thank you all for the invitation to be here. Thank you, Dean and Frank, and thank you for that song. It's wonderful to hear you sing again. I know that there have been a lot of discussions at universities across the country about calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because in our report we talk about the importance of education and the fact that education is the key to reconciliation going forward. Not only education at the post-secondary level, but education at the school level as well. Earliest grades possible should be hearing a bit about and having, in fact, their own sense of their relationship with Indigenous and non-Indigenous classmates reinforced as they grow older. If you think about it, how many of you are in education here incidentally? Most of you. If you think about why it is that you went into education, about why it is you wanted to become a teacher, it was because you have an inherent love for children, I think. I think it's because you have that respect and desire to influence the way that children are raised in this society. And yet in many respects, you're a latecomer in their lives when it comes to teaching, right? The first teacher for each and every child is his mother or her mother. And we have to understand that, and we have to respect that. And if you as teachers understand that and work with that and build upon what it is that they have learned already from their mothers, then you will help them to become the kind of child that they were intended to be from the moment of conception. Because it's from that moment coming forward that the mother is teaching them and is influencing them and who they are. Particularly when they're little children and they're playing together in the playgrounds and in the sandboxes, and you see how they play together, they learn things from each other, they have respect for each other as little children. And in fact, there is a fellow who's made a whole career about one book that he wrote about it called Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Sandbox, playing in the sandbox. Learned as a little kid. Because it is about reinforcing those very basic rules that are natural rules for our behavior towards each other. Little children respect each other. They respect what each other brings to the relationship. And some are stronger than others, some are faster than others, some are taller than others, and some are different hair color. But they get by that, and they deal with those things that they bring to the relationship, whatever that might be, and make the relationship work with all of that. And so children inherently reconcile right from the beginning. And then they move forward in that state of mutual respect. And then we come along as adults in their lives and we screw it up. Just as people in your lives have screwed it up for you. And you have to fix that somehow as educators. We have to figure out a way to ensure that that inherent respect that children, little children have for each other early on in their lives is maintained and is built upon as they grow older and get educated further in the system, so that by the time they are adults, they can still maintain that sense of respect, even knowing the differences that each might bring to a relationship, and knowing that newcomers coming into their lives from other parts of the world will bring differences, but still having a willingness to be respectful, to work with each other, and to deal with those differences in a proper way. So that's all said in order to say hi, because you have important work. And my hope is that there's something that I can say tonight, or something in the report that you will be able to read that will help you understand that and help to make that work. I want to play this video for you, and I want to acknowledge the survivors who are here. This video is about the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's really about the survivors and those who were there during our hearings. And it's not as intense as many of the videos that we've recorded, but it does have its intense moments. But it does, I think, bring home to everybody what this work of the Commission is all about. And so, with your permission, I will play this, and then I'll talk about what it is that we learned and show you the calls to action that relate to education. My apologies for the feedback, but sometimes they overpower me. I know that some parts of that video were a little intense, so I trust that we've all been able to get through it. One of the elements of the work of the TRC that we focused on a lot was the question of reconciliation with the survivors. And the question we asked the most of them was, what do we need to do? What is it that you would like us to talk about in our final report when it comes to reconciliation? And there was a great deal of consternation, if I can use that word, at the outset over that word, because it's a hard word to define. If you think about reconciliation in your own way, and your experience with the term, reconciliation has a lot of meanings in English, has a lot of potential meanings. It's one of those contextual words that takes its meaning from surrounding circumstances. So, for example, for accountants, reconciliation means this column has got a balance with this column. For lawyers, it's, are you guys going to get back together, or can we really go through with this divorce? Or reconciliation has a different sense of what it's intended to achieve. And layering over all of that is that in the Christian faith, almost all of the churches have what they call is the doctrine of reconciliation, a doctrine of reconciliation, which is that once you have acknowledged your sin, once you have done the penance, once you have forgiven yourself for what it is that you have done, then you are entitled to be forgiven. God will forgive you if you acknowledge the wrong and the sin. And so reconciliation had become quite a point of discussion between us. And then it became layered over with the whole question of forgiveness. Where does forgiveness fit into the reconciliation dialogue? And all of that was part of what we discussed with survivors and with others for the 6.5 years that we were in place. But the one thing that I do know is this, and that is that reconciliation can be achieved without forgiving anybody, without forgiveness. Because if forgiveness is an element of reconciliation that is a prerequisite, then it can almost amount to a re-victimization of the victim. To require them to forgive when they are not ready or unable to forgive is to put them in a position of feeling more guilt about what it is that they've done. So we refrained from making that an issue. But we did talk about the fact that carrying anger forward can be damaging. And that was when we talked about the importance of healing and finding a way to heal. Reconciliation as a part of the healing process is important because, as Archbishop Desmond Tutu says in his writings about reconciliation, if you carry that anger with you everywhere you go, it will only do two things. You will either use it to hurt somebody, or you will use it to hurt yourself. But that anger can only achieve pain, can only achieve that harm. And so you have to figure out a way to come to terms with that anger and put it down. And whatever one thinks of Archbishop Tutu and the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which he headed, the fact that he gave it so much thought and dedicated so much of his time to it tells you that it's an important part of the conversation around reconciliation. But we're here tonight to talk about the issue of education. So let me move to that in the time that I have left with you. Because education is important, and we know that education is important. Now I'm going to start the slides, so they'll play in the background. They'll be up on the screen in the background. I'm not going to talk and read them out to you specifically. My guess is that you will probably be sick of people talking with you about them by the time your education is finished, but you can just follow along and take a look at what they say while I talk to you. When I say education is important, it's that every society places a great deal of importance upon the education of its children. The education of children has always been acknowledged as something that society wants to achieve in order to be able to progress and develop as a society. And in traditional indigenous societies, it was no different. Indigenous societies always recognized the important role of teachers. There are many words for teachers in indigenous societies. One of the things we learned in listening to survivors and listening to the elders who came, presented to us and talked to us about how to come to terms with this experience of residential schools and the issue of education, was that the idea of a teacher is a constant in the lives of everybody. Even as you grow older, even into your elderly years, you are not just a teacher, but you are also a student of other teachers. And you learn, in fact, from the people that you are teaching, the things that you yourself can use as a teacher in other circumstances. So education is important. Learning is important. Plato, and in one of our sessions, one of the elders rephrased the questions that Plato identified as the important rules of life. Plato said that there are 5 very important questions that you have to be able to answer as you're growing up. One of them is, what is this creation all about? Why does this universe exist? But when it comes to the individual, it's about, where do I come from? That is, what's my history? What is the history of my people? But also, what is our creation story? And that's an important question, because you need to know about your people. You need to know about yourself. You need to know about how you were born, how you were created. That's part of growing up, part of understanding, part of living, part of understanding the relationship you're going to have with other people or with another person as you grow older. Where do I come from? Where do children come from? Where did we come from as human beings? And where do others come from? What is their teaching? So understanding those questions related to that question is all connected together. Where do I come from? It's about understanding our roots. It's about understanding what has put me together in this world. And the second question is, where am I going? And that's not just about what am I going to do later this afternoon, or what am I going to do tomorrow, or what am I going to do next week, or what do I want to be when I grow up. It's about that. But it's also about what happens to me when I die. What happens to us when we leave this creation? What is that next world all about? What happens to our bodies when we die? So where am I going is a very important question. And it comes from understanding that first question too. Because if you understand what creation is all about, then you understand a little bit at least of what life is all about and what death is all about. And putting that into perspective for yourself is very important. And so understanding that second question is related to understanding that first question. And you have to know those answers. And you have to know the answers to those questions that are consistent with what it is that your family, your community, the people with whom you are connected have to say about it as well. Because it gives you a sense of belonging. Knowing where you come from and knowing where your people come from gives you that sense of belonging, gives you a sense of collectiveness. That's very important because we all want to take pride in who we are. And that third question is, why am I here? What is my purpose in life? We all struggle with that. And as educators, in fact, one of the things that you will be challenged to do as teachers with little children and with middle school and high school children is to help them to understand what is it they want to become and to help them to become what they want to be. In a practical sense, you have to give them the educational experience that they need to be able to become that. But in addition to that, you have to give them the personal skills that they will need in order to be able to function in that way. Because if they want to become a doctor, if they want to become a lawyer, if they want to become a mechanic, whatever it is they want to become, there are certain basic skills that they'll need to develop in school that you will help them develop. But it's also understanding about the role of those things in society that you will also help them to understand as well. And in traditional Ojibwe society, and it's not but one example because all traditional peoples have their own teaching around that. But in traditional Ojibwe society, that question of who am I comes partially from answering the question of where does my name come from or what does my name mean? My name is Mzinagijik. Mzinagijik simply means pictures in the sky or writings in the sky. But there's a story behind that name. And the story is about a young man who goes out each day in order to ask the Creator to show him things that he can use to help people understand what's going on. So that name that I carry, that has been given to me, was given to me a long time ago, before I started any of this work. But it's also an old name. I actually came across it in one of the recordings of the Jesuit relations from the 16th century about this Indian leader in Ontario whose name was Mzinagijik. And they wrote about him because he was one who was always contradicting the Christian teachings, who was always arguing against what the missionaries were telling the people about what they needed to do. So I kind of figured that would go right with me. It was kind of consistent with challenging, with causing people to think about who they really are and not about what others wanted them to become. And so that name has a meaning to it. But the understanding of why am I here also comes from understanding your clan and what your clan is, and what your spirit connection is, what your spirit clan is, and the role that that clan plays in the tribe. So I am of the water clan people, the fish clan, particularly, specifically the rainbow trout. And there are teachings around those clans and what their role is. We are the philosophers and the dreamers. We're also the arbitrators. We're also the clan that stands between the two chief clans. In our system, there's one chief clan that represents the people to other tribes, so external chief. And then there's an internal chief who manages the affairs of the tribe on a daily basis. So those two chiefs have to work together. And if they can't agree, then it's the water clan head who helps them to mediate their differences. So that's the teaching of my clan. But it's also about philosophy and understanding and thinking about things and working through those problems. And when I know that, it helps me to understand what my role can be and what the clan role can be if I choose to follow that. I could also become a mechanic. And then I could become a guy who resolves disputes between car owners and service technicians in garages. But it's part of understanding the role of the clan and that you belong to it. And that was part of our traditional teaching. It helps you to understand, why am I here? What is my purpose in life? And as teachers, you will be called upon to help young people understand that question. Why are they here? Why am I here? Why were human beings created? That's partly a religious question, but it's also partly a philosophical question that you will help them to resolve. And helping them to understand that part of their life is part of your challenge as an educator. And that leads to the fourth question. And the fourth question is the question that really never has an answer until the very last moment of life. And that question is, who am I? Because it isn't really who am I, it's who do I want to be, or who should I be? It's about character, it's about motive, it's about inspiration, it's about what is it that you want to be doing? How do you want to live your life? So, who am I is a big question as well. Plato recognized that. He wrote an entire book about that, questions of life. And the big question that they all help you answer is, where do I belong? And that was Plato's question about what is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of life? And where do I belong is also a big question. You know, finding out where I belong is very, very important for everybody. And again, as teachers, you're going to have to recognize when students are struggling with that question to help them to understand it. And that's why one of the focuses that we've created in our calls to action is to call upon educational institutions like faculties of education, universities, and schools to help educators to learn how to help Indigenous children in the public schools or in schools generally to answer that question for themselves. Because we didn't learn that growing up. I was educated in the public schools of this province. I graduated from the public schools of this province, near the head of my class. I had very good marks. I was a valedictorian of my high school graduating class, and I went on to study education for a while, but then dropped out and went to law school. But the intention that I always had was to help people. In fact, my grandmother made me promise that I would do something with my education to help people in order that I could move into the university entrance program. They had streaming back in those days. They still sort of have it now, but they don't call it that anymore. But I couldn't move into the university entrance program unless my parents, and my grandmother was my guardian, unless she consented. And so she said, I'll sign this paper, but you have to promise that you will do something with this education and you will help people. Always promise to help people. So I have this feeling that when I actually do get to retire, and I'm not sure that that's ever going to happen, but if I ever do get to retire, I'll probably volunteer as a Walmart greeter, just so I can say every day, well, I helped somebody today. But it is important to understand the role that we have to play. But understanding those 4 questions, and the question of where do I belong is really all about identity. When I was a young lawyer back in the 80s, I was doing a presentation to the chiefs of Manitoba. They invited me to come and talk about the Constitution. And so I did everything I could to avoid talking about the Constitution because nobody really understood what it all meant anyway. So I talked about my favorite story as a child growing up, and it was the little duckling, the little ugly duckling. Do you remember that story? I don't know if they still teach it in schools anywhere. Anybody know? I don't think so. They do. They offer it in the Mother Goose books. But when I was in school, they actually used it as a teaching tool. It was probably one of the stories that we read, or that was read to us when I was in grade school. And it's a story of a little duckling who has been raised in a family of ducklings with a mother duck. And all of the ducklings abuse this little duckling and call him ugly. Tell everybody that he's ugly, and they tell him constantly that he's just an ugly little duckling. And not only do the little ones that he's growing up with treat him like that, but the other ducklings, the other big ducks, they all treat him like that too. They all call him an ugly little duckling. And he becomes ashamed, and he becomes sad, and he becomes depressed. And Walt Disney did a cartoon based on this. And there was a song written about it by, it was Danny Kaye, I think. There once was an ugly duckling. I don't want to sing it to you. But, Google it, or go to YouTube and see if you can find it. But it's a story about this duckling who is treated horribly because he's ugly, and he doesn't look like any of the other ducks. He just doesn't belong. They won't let him play, they won't treat him well. They'll treat him very poorly. And it was my favorite story because that's how I felt growing up. I was good at everything I did. I was a top athlete in my school. I was top marks in school. But nobody really, after I left my grade school, nobody really wanted to play with me. Nobody really wanted me to be part of their gangs, and I couldn't afford to kind of go to the places that they went to. I couldn't dress like they dressed. But I couldn't hang out with the cool guys and the cool people. I couldn't really hang out with even the people who weren't cool. I just didn't fit in. Because I moved from a smaller school into a large high school. So there was that element of moving into a larger school, but it was also because there weren't that many Indigenous kids who were doing well in that school. And we all got treated very poorly. And so growing up, I always felt like I was being treated poorly. I always felt, in fact, I went back for the 25th anniversary of my high school graduating class. Because I was a valedictorian at my graduation, I was invited to say a few words at the 25th gathering. And I said then what I believed then and still believe today, and that is that it saddens me to think that when we graduated together, all of us, that not one of you would have traded places with me, despite the fact that I was doing so well. And I, in fact, was the athlete of the year. And I won all these bursaries. That's what allowed me to go to university and had good marks. But not one person, I'm sure, in my high school class would have traded places with me because we lived in the north end of town. We lived where all the Indigenous people lived. And we were poor. And everybody in our neighborhood was poor. And so, and of course, racism was rampant in the place where I grew up. Everybody talked negatively about Indians. Indians were never just Indians. They were dirty Indians, or they were stupid Indians. but there was always some pejorative attached to that. And so we had to deal with that growing up. And it has taken us a long time now to recognize the wrongness of that. Young children were taken away from their families and placed in residential schools for 125 of Canada's 150 years of existence. We're going to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Confederation next year. And for 125 years, Indigenous children were forcibly removed by the government from their homes and placed into residential schools. The last school closed in 1996. 1996, within not just your lifetime, but within the lifetime of some of your children. And what that means is that for most of Canada's existence, it has treated Indigenous children with great abuse. You heard some of the things that were said about what occurred in residential school. That also occurred in some of the public schools as well, the way people were treated. The pejoratives that were imposed upon us, and the way that history was taught, the way that our people were talked about. I can remember in high school studying Canadian history, and when we talked about the great Canadian victories in war, there was never any mention of the fact that in order to win those wars, Indigenous support was needed. The War of 1812, you would have swore to God that Brock himself won that war single-handed, even though he was dead on the day the war ended. But that was how that was taught to us. There was not one mention of Tecumseh and his role in that war, and the fact that he was responsible for Canada's victory in the War of 1812. And that was never taught to us. And I can still remember the humiliation on the day they talked about how Father Jean Brebeuf's heart was torn from his body as he was burned at the stake. It was awful. It was awful because everybody turned to me in class as if to say, why did you do that to such a nice man? It was terrible. But in 1972 or so, the Manitoba Indian Brotherhood did a study called The Shocking Truth About Indians in Our Textbooks. I have a copy of that report because when I came across it, this was long after I graduated from high school, when I came across it, I was determined to ensure that something would be done about that. And that motivation has stayed with me all these years. And that motivation is something I want to ask each of you to pick up. And that motivation is this. I want you to teach children in your classes about us Indigenous people in this country, in a way that engenders and shows respect. That's what I want of you. And you know, you can do it without bending the truth, without changing history, without making up lies. You can do it by simply telling the truth. Because the truth of the matter is that for much of the history of this country, Indigenous people have been major contributors to the way that this nation has evolved. And it's only been since Confederation that racism, through colonialism, through whatever words you want to use, has been part of the conversation that has led to the undermining of Indigenous people. Canada waged war against Indigenous people through law. It's as simple as that. I speak to lawyers and judges all the time, and I go through statute by statute every single law that Canada passed, which undermined the right of Indigenous people to be human beings in this nation, to participate in this nation. The fact that their right to govern themselves was taken away. The right to raise their children was taken away. The right to educate their children was taken away. Their right to protest was taken away. Their right to vote was taken away. Their right to go to court was taken away. Their right even to wear their own clothing was taken away. Their right to speak their language, the right to leave their communities, their right to participate in the Canadian economy, their right to have services in their communities, were all subverted by Canadian government. And that attitude towards Indigenous people on the part of the Canadian government permeated through all of society, so that even in the public schools of this country, our people were talked about in a very negative way. Indigenous people were talked about as though they were a problem that needed to be overcome in order for this country to be great. And that's not true. This country could be much greater than it is today if Canada had learned how to work with Indigenous people to make it what it could have been. And we are now bearing the consequences of that. We are now living out the result of that. And all of these calls to action that you see here in front of you are intended to show a path for Canada to build the foundation for a new relationship going forward. There is much that is not known yet, and we're saying you need to learn what that is. There is much that remains to be done in terms of changing laws, in terms of creating new legal regimes, creating new ways of being, new orders of being and doing things. There are limitations that have to be placed upon government itself that need to be recognized. And we say, if you really are serious about reconciliation in this country, this is the way to achieve it. And what your role is, as educators, though, is not to necessarily be concerned about all of this, although you need to know at the end of the day where this is all going to. But if your one accomplishment in life is that you educate the children under your control to be respectful towards each other, you will have made the single most significant contribution to reconciliation that anyone could ever ask of you. And so I ask that of you. Please, do that. And in this faculty, we ask that all of those who are being educated to become teachers in this province and elsewhere be educated to understand that responsibility. Be educated to understand that they have a role to play in the lives of those young students, and that they have a significant place in society as well when it comes to reconciliation. I have a great deal of respect for the decision that was made to ensure that the number of teachers that this faculty admits is representative of the population of Indigenous people in this province, because without that kind of extraordinary effort, it's not going to happen. And the reason it's not going to happen is not because there are not capable people out there. It's because the doorways to getting to here are closed. The opportunities are not the same for us. The means by which it takes for us to get here are not the same means. And being a teacher includes that you need to be able to experience your education as well alongside those who live that experience. But at the end of the day, we need to ensure that those who are being educated and who are going to work with Indigenous children are able to educate them in a way that allows them to be consistent with what they are, what their answers are to those 4 questions that I talked about. Understanding where you come from, where you're going, why you are here, and who you are is part of your responsibility to our children as well. So thank you for letting me be part of this evening and part of your symposium. And I appreciate the interest that you're showing in the work of the TRC. Thank you.
Seekos, Kanagoa. Anong yoda sinjats. Ganyagehaga ni itanagwago. Most of you know me as Frank, though. It's a pleasure to offer some closing remarks today. And it seems to me that I have to afford some privilege to my area when considering the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to actions, that area being primary and secondary education. When I think of some of the principal proxies for understanding where Indigenous people are in that journey, there are some immediate and recent items in the news and in some reports that have emerged from the provincial authorities that tell me that there's a lot of work to be done. One emerged from in recent months. It was the report from the provincial government about what they referred to as the proxy cohort graduation rate for people. And it tells me that, in a sense, Manitoba is doing well in the area of graduation rates. So, in fact, 87% of those who were a member of a particular cohort in 2014 were graduated with their respective proxy cohort. So, and that's a rate that's been rising recently. If you're a non-Indigenous graduate, in respect to your proxy cohort, 96% had graduated with the respective cohort. So that's been rising for a while too. If you are an Indigenous person, however, in province of Manitoba, it was 54% of graduates successfully graduated, that is, from their respective proxy cohort, so half. And that's been pretty stagnant for the last few years. So, and that's one way of considering how far we have to go. But I think there is an upside to all of the work that we are about to take up. I hope on the back of the TRC calls to action and other initiatives that are emerging elsewhere. It seems to me that a lot of these discussions are very new, and a lot of these discussions are subject to a lot of discussion, a lot of negotiation. We're still trying to work out where we situate ourselves with the Canadian Indigenous experience, and I'm excited to be a part of that. When I think about that progress, I also think of some of the ways in which we can respond as people who are associated with primary and secondary education, as well as other related fields. A few things come to mind. When I read the calls to action, and when I had a look at the lengthy report that was released by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, it's been a long night. I'm starting to stumble over my words here. I'm reminded of something that Marie Baptiste, a scholar from the University of Saskatchewan, once said. And that's that within the journey towards the infusion, if you will, of Indigenous perspectives into primary and secondary education, and certainly in teacher education within Indigenous contexts, it's important to consider the unique manifestations of Indigenous knowledge, heritage, consciousness, and tradition. So that's a long-winded way of saying that it's important to consider the local context in which you situate that, right? Many make mention of the pan-Canadian approach to exploring the Canadian Indigenous experience, and that's important to be very critical of, and to make sure that you're honoring the lands that you're on, the people with whom you're working, and the culture that's associated with whatever curricular or non-curricular activity you might be engaged with. Those who know me know that I have an interest in Indigenous languages, and I can't help but make reference to some of those items in the calls to action that are associated with language. And you may have read in the slideshow, for instance, calls to action 13 and 14 associated with that. And I think that's one way in which I think we can begin to appreciate the rationale for some of these calls to action. When one says they're referring to themselves as Indigenous person, it's frequently done with a reference to nationhood, with reference to community, if you will, but often there is a language-based referent at work there. And many do continue to appreciate that language is one of those dimensions of Indigenous identities that have been underexplored and, of course, has been mentioned this evening, adversely affected by the residential school experience. So I'm very interested in how language, how community experiences, how histories are dealt with. And I think that puts a responsibility on a variety of different quarters, and certainly ourselves as initial teacher education programs bear some of that responsibility. We are doing some good things, as David made mention of at the outset, but I do affirm what he said earlier, that there's a lot yet to do. In regard to Indigenous student success, in regard to having community-based teachers in Indigenous communities, and to explore Indigenous content in our courses, in our primary and secondary schools, with a view of assisting all students, regardless of ancestry, about that history. And it's a history that we have to own. And I'm glad that Senator Justice Murray Sinclair has reminded us of that, and it's a very important message. So with that, I want to thank Carl, I want to thank Rye, I want to thank our Dean David Manzik, Justice Murray Sinclair, my fellow presenter Melanie Jensen, and everybody. I've never seen this room this full, but it's lovely that you've come out here on a Tuesday evening to join us. So, you know, in my language, which I'm trying to reclaim, Niawagoa, thank you very much. I hope to see some of you at tomorrow's event here next door in room 200. So, Niawagoa, thank you very much.